Welcome to episode 51 of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager, one of the VPs at Sumer Sports. I'm joined by the CEO of Sumer Sports, Thomas Dimitroff, a man who is no stranger to post-draft feelings, post-draft analysis, post-draft everything. We're all back. Thomas is still in Atlanta. We're all back from Atlanta from the draft this past weekend. Thomas, how are you feeling after a long weekend?
It was a long weekend. It was great to see the group come together from an analytics standpoint, and not just a whole bunch of football guys looking at players, which, of course, is the way the world goes, of course. But I was just amazed to watch it all play out the way it did. It's funny because I started thinking, could we truly have done 3 full days? That would have been a bear. Does anyone third-party group do 3 full days?
Well, yeah. So when I was at PFF, we did 4 shows. We did a Thursday night show for round 1. We would do rounds 2 and 3 on Friday, and then we would do all day Saturday, and then we'd have a recap on Sunday. Now, once I got high up enough, I was like, look, I'm doing Thursday, and then I'll help out a little, but I'll come in, I'll zoom in for 1 or 2 of those, but I'm not doing the whole thing because, you know, at some point, like, you're just talking about the teams at that point because the picks are coming in so fast, and, you know, you're not giving everybody as much of the shine as they deserve, being one of the few players that's ever drafted into the NFL. So yeah, we did the Thursday show. By the way, I want to thank everybody for coming by. We had, you know, quite a few listeners, not only the podcast, but also in the live show, both on Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube. We really do appreciate all of you who have made that a part of your draft experience. If you haven't already, you can obviously go back and look. Even the short 15-minute video of myself and Paul Tudor Jones while Thomas was off doing very, very critical CEO duties is up there as well. Paul tried to talk me off of a ledge because the Detroit Lions took Jahmyr Gibbs at 12 while we were talking, and in fact offered me Chinese food on the spot, which was pretty funny. As far as this goes, Thomas, like, how much stock when you were in that chair did you put into, sort of the grades? Because I know we showed this on the show on Thursday, but there were often players that you took that the draft media weren't real big fans of. And, you know, there's a strength of your conviction, obviously, that has to come through. But there's also, you know, you do pay attention to these things, and, you know, folks like, you know, me, or folks like, you know, Mel Kiper and you know, the folks on ESPN, they're going to grade your draft, like, have to, like, this is a media thing, and it drives, the popularity of the league. And so it's important, but how much do you pay attention to that when you're actually in the chair making decisions?
Absolutely nothing. And the reason I say that is, of course you do. You look at them, you're not paying attention with regard to whether you made a mistake or not. It's not that. You only pay attention to it as far as if your owner is really into the media and is very cognizant of what's being said within the community, then you have to be prepared. I know that sounds a little odd, but for instance, Arthur Blank was very dialed into our community in Atlanta and very dialed in. So I knew, and I think you could go back and look at every one of my drafts as a general manager, our drafts, but mine as a general manager. And I swear to God, I don't think I ever got over a B. And we used to joke about that in our roles. We'd say, well, if you've been feeding Mel Kiper, you would get an A or an A+. But if you were rarely talking to Mel, you never would. That's one side, because it's changed a lot, right? There are a lot more people that are putting their stuff out there. You know, you get guys like Bucky Brooks and DJ who are really, really good football people and understand it well, and a lot of other people, of course. I would say we do not look at those grades, and we all know not only do we not look at them as a judgment of how we've done, as much as, you know, and the same thing goes for we are always thinking within the next 3 or 4 years you can truly determine that. So we fight it a lot. The reality is, the last thing I'll say, we fight it, but no one wants to see a D attached to their name. I don't care who they are. They can say they don't care. Of course they care.
Yeah, luckily, our friend Benjamin Robinson, who, by the way, you know, obviously we used a decent amount of his work with Grinding the Mocks on our draft show. He did the work. This is from an article from Football Outsiders from 2020, where he shows that the draft grade. And again, he did some work to kind of normalize it because a lot of places will give out a lot of A's and not that many F's and all that kind of stuff. But basically, if you look from left to right, a -3 would be like an F grade, and a 2 would be like an A+ grade. He normalized it again because there are different scales for different evaluators. But he showed Thomas. Now, I know that I don't know how much this graph is going to mean to you, but basically, if this graph sloped upward, right, that blue line was bottom left to upper right, that means that the draft grades meant a lot. If it was sloping downward, up left to bottom right, that would mean that the draft grades are actually inversely proportional. And since it's flat, that means that draft grades basically have no bearing on how it does, right? So so the media has done a notoriously poor job of being able to predict how well teams have drafted. And I think a lot of that reason, Thomas, is because, ultimately the draft is kind of a wisdom of the crowd sort of thing, right? Like for the most part, consensus builds, right? And there's a great book by Jim Schwaricki called, Wisdom of the Crowds, where basically it's like no one mock draft is that great at predicting players and how well they'll do. But if you average over all of the mock drafts, they generally do an okay job. And over time, that's been a lot of the case. So, what we don't want to see sometimes is, teams taking too many players off what's called the consensus, right? So if you're overdrafting the consensus board over and over and over again, that might not be the best thing in the world. Or if you're underdrafting, like if everybody thinks you're having a steal, well, all that means necessarily is that the analyst prediction of where the players should go was a little bit lower or better than where they actually went, and you got a steal in their mind. So ultimately, you were probably right for not paying any attention to these post-draft grades because, in essence, they're just creating content and they don't necessarily have any predictive power. What possibly could have predictive power is whether or not you draft above or beyond the consensus board, which is again the amalgamation of all of the public boards. But does that kind of jive with your reality? I mean, you were lauded for some picks, but you were also derided for, let's say, the Julio Jones trade or for the AJ Terrell pick, 2 picks that ultimately ended up being Pro Bowl and all pro players.
Yeah, I think, you look at it that way and you start thinking, and you start looking at your group, you start thinking about 14 months worth of work and a lot of effort. And in our minds, every once in a while, not all, believe me, because I have some guys that I really respect, but some jackass out there throws a D- on you and everyone's ready to rip the guy's head off just because. And I'm like, well, I thought we said this didn't matter. Why are you guys so upset about it? What I will say, which is interesting, however, is, the people that are writing their follow-up grades on the drafts, people remember that. So GMs will remember the ones that give them good ones, and they'll remember the ones that gave them, horse crap grades. And believe me, they get a little snarky with those media people later, like, oh, well, you didn't like our team, so why are you even here? It's a little bit of a back and forth, goofy. And it's the same thing with the media people, probably, right? They're not getting something from someone and they don't have an interest at all. They're like, I didn't like that at all. I mean, I'll be interested to see. I mean, how were the media in general regarding the Detroit Lions? By the way, restore the roar stuff for you.
Yeah, congratulations, by the way, to my former intern Haley English, who just got a job with the Detroit Lions today. I announced that on Twitter. I'm really proud there. So even though I didn't necessarily like their 2 draft picks as much as I liked other draft picks, I'm really happy with the choice that they made at the analyst spot. We will talk about the Lions in a little bit here. I just do want to bring this up. This is also from Benjamin Robinson, Grinding the Mocks. Now, Thomas, this is not necessarily a grade, but what this did is look at where players were projected to go by the consensus relative to where they actually went. So these are the teams on the top who picked players who were projected to go earlier that fell to them, and players or teams on the bottom that took players that were projected to go later and took them earlier. So as we talked about here, Detroit, they took Jahmyr Gibbs at 12. He was expected to go much later. They took Jack Campbell at 18. He was expected to go much later. However, they did take Brian Branch, a guy that we talked about on the Sumer Sports Show in large part because he was supposed to be a first-round pick. They took him in round 2, so that would be on the other side of the ledger. And then they took quarterback quarterback Hendon Hooker in the 3rd round, who by many people's guess was a first-round prospect. So it kind of came out and even a little bit. Kansas City was another team that, they picked players a little bit earlier than that they were, quote, supposed to go. We'll see how that ends up turning out. The Cleveland Browns, somebody who you interviewed, by the way, on the GM Journey podcast, Andrew Berry, a disciple of the Philadelphia Eagles, Howie Roseman, who again was lauded for picking players, Nolan Smith being one of them, who was supposed to go in the top half of the first round, went near the bottom of the first round to Philadelphia with the second to last pick, the 30th pick. The Titans get praise, of course, for taking Will Levis at 34 when he was supposed to go much earlier. Again, these aren't necessarily to grade the drafts. They're just saying this was what was expected by the mocks going into the draft, and this is kind of how it shook out. I'll be very interested to see, because Ben's been doing this work for a short amount of time, whether or not these are actually predictive of draft success.
How long has Ben been doing this work, by the way?
2018, 2019. So it's been, basically right now, that's 2 and almost 3 now. When you're looking at fifth year options, that's a good way to look at it, is like whether or not the fifth year option was exercised by these first round picks. But we'll have to, go back and look. I think Ben's great work has been in, providing us data, as a public, as well as some private, folks in the league, as well as also other vendors. His great work has been to, sort of adding these, these big, large data sets for us to look at. But it's very interesting to see kind of what's happening here.
So let's talk mocks for a minute here, because, from team to team, things are, everyone has different opinions about how you approach them, right? We weren't using mocks. We would use them as, an indicator of where someone might go. And it was fun to look at them. It was more the enjoyment of just kind of looking at, after you've looked at someone for 14 months, kind of follow where things were going in general. It wasn't like we hung off the edge, and no one does in the league at all, quite honestly. Some of us do mock drafts going in like we did, like literally they actually perform mock drafts with their personnel department. Others couldn't give a flip about it. In Atlanta, interestingly enough, the person that cared the most about it was all Arthur Blank and his kids, right? So, a month out, our people started really grinding their own mocks to get Arthur Blank. And at that point, we were probably operating off of 30. We determined who we thought the top 30 were, and that's where we're going. Grinding the mocks, just for perspective, how many different mocks does he grind, so to speak? You're
talking about hundreds to thousands by the time it's all said and done. And he does a great job of scraping them off the web and sort of taking the average. I think as the draft gets further and further going, though, like they distribute them, sort of, and Arif Hassan, by the way, who had dinner with us when we were at the combine, he does the consensus big board. He recently did it for The Athletic. He did it also, now does it for Pro Football Network. He has a different mock depending upon whether it's supposed to be predictive, whether it's supposed to be just big boards, and then whether it's media. So he'll break it up for 3 different ones. So like Dane Brugler from The Athletic, his is more of a big board, whereas, somebody who's trying to actually predict what's going to happen in the first few rounds, like that's a different saying. You might like Will Anderson better than CJ Stroud, but you might say CJ Stroud's going to get picked earlier because he's a quarterback. So there's a little bit of a different thing too, which is a difference between a big board and how you see things mocked. I actually was watching Trent Baalke's press conference, and he was saying, like, we will scenario plan all these different things, and then it all gets blown up, and you can't possibly scenario plan so many scenarios. And I'm going to clip it and send it to our, Paul Tudor Jones, you and Jack, because I'm like, well, actually, that's what we're trying to do at Sumer Sports, is obviously give our clients an opportunity to do that as many times as they can. So to me, that's like where I see the league going, is being able to scenario plan better, because it is like you get to that point, right? And you're like, have you ever, Thomas, gotten to a point in a draft where, you kind of planned out all these different things, and then a player, like, take Detroit, right? Everybody mocked Devon Witherspoon to Detroit. It was better than it was favored against the field that they were going to take him. Like, the biggest favorite in the first round after the first pick was Detroit Devon Witherspoon for most of this time. And Seattle was kind of the wild card. We didn't know what they were going to take, and they take Witherspoon, and it could have, and I have no inside information here, and I'm just guessing, but they trade out of the pick immediately after. And it's like, was there ever a situation like that where you saw the draft playing out way differently than it ever did? Seattle doesn't really need a corner, but they took one anyway. High value position, a guy you liked a lot, I liked a lot. He goes 5. Detroit's, their plans, they're in some ways, to quote Mike Tyson, they got punched in the mouth.
So I would say yes, those kind of things happen, and that's nerve-wracking when it completely goes and totally goes a different way, right? Because it's nice to feel like you have your ducks in line, right? That's a big thing for most of us as general managers. You want to feel the security that you've prepared, you've articulated everything to your owner, right? That's another thing that's really interesting.
Yep.
You want to be the guy, as I've used the word omniscient, and you want to be the person that knows everything about everything going into the draft. And then when you're sitting there with your owner beside you and like, this is what's going to happen. And all of a sudden the world turns upside down. It makes you feel a little bit like a dumbass, right? You're like, and he looks at you thinking, I thought you were the expert in this. How are you so far off? Like you kind of want to say like, look, the reality is you never know. Right. So yeah, it's an interesting situation with what happened there. But there are people out there, and you and I have talked about this. There's need and there's best player, but they kind of mix together, right? I know what John Schneider and Pete Carroll did. They were looking, saying, yes, of course, the whole, should we take Jalen Carter or not? Or should we take, Devon Witherspoon? Both of those guys are top notch at their position, and maybe some of the best at their position that has come along in a while. And, we think they don't need a corner, but believe me, there's a reason that they looked at that and said, look, we need both. Well, we need the D-line position, but let's go with this guy that we could maybe build with for years and years to come. And maybe they think, like a lot of people do, they can get D linemen that can get them through what they need to get through. And maybe another time they'll approach the defensive lineman. Because look, that was that was 5, right? I mean,
it was a surprise. It was a surprise to everybody because people felt like there was a chance, it felt like there was a chance that Anthony Richardson would go there and they would like him a lot, but he went at 4. There was obviously Carter was still on the board and they didn't end up taking him. There was many who thought Will Anderson could still be there if all 4 quarterbacks went the first 4 picks. And, but none of us really thought that he could, there was no mocks really that had him going there. And the betting markets were very heavy. You could have made a decent amount of money if you had bet Detroit to go running back with their first pick, of course. And that was not necessarily that predictable. Before we move on, because I want to talk about 4 different topics today. I want to talk about what Houston did. I want to talk about what the Lions did, and then Will Levis falling. And I want to talk about the 49ers taking a kicker. By the way, we got a couple good, Tay Steth, one of our great data scientists, love the outfits from both co-hosts here. By the way, I do want to shout out my friends Cade, who had you on the show. I got sent this really nice windbreaker thing from the Wharton guys at Wharton Moneyball, and I'm wearing it now because it's a little chilly in your home state of Ohio, Thomas. So you'll love that. But I like this one, the Beat Gamer 99. The grade is also subjective. They haven't talked to the prospects and don't know how the team has experience interacting with the player, and that could change the evaluation. I 100%, when I think about this, I think about, these are the things that are not embedded in the public. And even though, if you look at, sumersports.com, you look at the Draft Proverbs episode the article that we have up there, talk about that a little bit there, where how many things, I think that those almost always skew negative for a player. Like when a player does all these things out loud that are great, that everybody can see in the media, but there's something in the medical or there's something in the individual eval that can drop a player. But Thomas, you also have the other side of it, right? If you interact with a player and you're just like, God, that guy's got a way about him, or that guy's got something going for him. Reports are that, that Bryce Young had a similar experience, right? That can lift them up. Does that kind of where you look at, let's say you were going to look at a public mock and you're like, this is where the media is getting it wrong. Is it almost entirely off the field stuff where you guys have information that we as the public wouldn't have?
Yeah, it definitely is off the field information. It's of course character, it's medical, it's the true football knowledge of it all, right? Not talking about the academia element, talking about X and O scheme, intuition, ability to pick things up. Just that is really, really important. Now, let me just say, I heard there was discussion out there about Mike Tomlin not liking Christian Gonzalez, right? And I was thinking about that. I'm like, this is a perfect example, right? Not liking him because, Christian Gonzalez is a jackass or anything like that. Far from that. He's a great kid in so many ways. But a guy like Mike Tomlin, Mike's a tough dude. Mike knows what he wants, and he's expecting certain things out of his guy he's going to ride with in the next few years to come. And it may be some small element that prevented him from necessarily liking him as the guy that they're going to grow with for years to come. So what I'd say is sometimes it's small, sometimes it's very big, and everyone knows about that. And to your point, sometimes you do meet someone and you're thinking, man, I would trade back for this guy. There's no way that I would pull this guy in the top 8 or 9 picks or 10 picks. And then you meet with them and you're just enthralled, right? Everything about that person hit. Its intelligence, his personality, his passion for the game, his ability to communicate. And you start daydreaming a little bit, right? You're like, God, this is the guy we wanted to be our leader in years to come. There are things like that are the true leadership side, right? I mean, I've talked to you many, many years about it. If you're a coach and or a GM and you find this guy that you think that you can build around, like some of the best leaders have come out over the years, that does move guys up at times. They're like, look, I know we don't necessarily need this guy that much, but I want this guy on this team, and that'll force you into or precipitate the move to go up.
For sure. And that we probably saw that in Houston. So let's transition to the Texans, where, by the time it got to draft week, Bryce Young was the overwhelming favorite to be the first pick. But as I showed on Twitter, @EricEager_ on Twitter, like the gears spun a lot for who was going to be the second pick. And it oscillated between, Will Anderson, Will Levis, Tyree Wilson even got a repetition there, and so on and so forth. It ultimately became CJ Stroud. And then after CJ Stroud, Houston made a bold move, moving up from 12 to 3 to get Will Anderson. I know your former colleague, Michael Lombardi, said, look, I know it was a big trade up, and we measured it at, if you just look at net value, it's about $135-ish million that it costs to go from 12 to 3 in asset value. If you looked at just, on the field value, it's about $118 million. So it's a big move, right? A big move for Will Anderson. And the reports are that the Texans had him as the number 1 player on their board, but took a quarterback to sort of appease, sort of both ends of the stick, right? And so Lombardi says, look, I know the trade was steep, but if you think about it, they weren't going to leave the first part of the draft without their best player, Will Anderson, and they weren't going to leave the first part of the draft without the quarterback, which at that time was CJ Stroud, the best guy on the board. So think about the trade in terms of trading up for a quarterback. And I don't buy that, because, again, I think that, in some way, I think, I just think it's a huge trade up no matter what. But I also think that if you're going up for a quarterback at that spot, that's great. But if you think a quarterback is worthy of that trade up, he should be the best player on your board, right? And so I get a little bit kind of twisty here. Now, Houston came into the draft with the most draft capital next year's draft. Now Arizona has that distinction. And because of the markets now, look at this, Thomas. This is from FanDuel. Both teams, Arizona and Houston, are projected to win 5.5 games. In fact, Arizona is projected to have the worst record in football by the betting markets. There is a realistic chance, Thomas, that the Arizona Cardinals end next year with the number 1 and number 2 overall pick in the following draft. Now, the last time that has happened, this was very early in your scouting career, Thomas, was 1992, when the Indianapolis Colts, right, who earned that Mel Kiper disdain, Bill Tobin, right, earned it. The Indianapolis Colts traded Chris Chandler, of all people, to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers for the second pick. Well, pick that ended up being the second pick. They got the first 2 picks in the draft. A gentleman by the name of Steve Entman, whose career was kind of derailed by injuries, and somebody named Quentin Coriat, who ended up having a pretty good career with the Colts. But that was the last time, Thomas, a team had the first and second pick in the draft. Arizona is currently favored to do that. This is a bold move by Houston. They need to win this year as a result, I think, in order to make this worth it. Do you think that they got enough to kind of take them out of a couple years where they've been struggling into a position where they're competing in that division?
I have said this all along in our preparation. I mean, where Houston is and the organization and all that was going on through the whole run of Deshaun Watson, et cetera, this organization needed 2 people that they could count on, 2 people that have consistency to them. I'm talking about 2 players. I thought I mean, I know it was very expensive, and I get all that. That's going to be complicated, and Nick is going to have to deal with that. Nick Caserio as the GM, of course. But I think as far as the moves and the people that are coming in, to Nick's credit, of course, he pulled the trigger on something that he thought was really, really important. I have been hearing a lot lately that Mr. McNair was a huge supporter, like basically one of those situations that he knocked on the proverbial door and said, we are taking CJ Stroud. Who knows if that played out that way? I would never, when you start hearing those things, you wonder, Nick would never talk about it. Nick is, as Peter King says, he's like the CIA, right? But look, they have a quarterback that they can grow with ostensibly and a really good defensive player. So those moves, I think, were legitimate moves. Nick comes back up to get who he wanted at the beginning of it all, I'm sure. So I think it was a win-win for that organization. Yes.
Yeah. Look, you start looking at pillars, right? You talk about pillars in team building. They got Derek Stingley last year with the 3rd overall pick. I think he's going to be a ball player. Obviously, Will Anderson now at edge. You got pass rush, you got coverage. I think he's going to be Jalen Petra, a defensive back. Played a pretty good season last year. Another guy that I think they can build around. And then on the offensive side of the ball, you have Laramie Tunsil, you have CJ Stroud. Laramie got a pretty good deal to be their left tackle, and now you also have Damian Pierce at running back. They have pieces now, right? When they moved Watson to Cleveland, they got a lot in return. And should they have more? Maybe, but they at least have pieces now that you identify with the Houston Texans. Like, I think one of the biggest issues with the Texans the last couple of years is, when you move Watson, you move Hopkins, Watt leaves, that you cut Watt because of salary and all that kind of stuff. Who could you really identify with the Houston Texans? And the answer now is CJ Stroud and Will Anderson. And that's, when you come out of it like that, I think that is, where you want to go. And that draft signals to me, right, because of how bad it would look if they continue to struggle on the field, right? The 1st and 2nd pick going to Arizona, they need to produce this year. And, given how the AFC South, like right now, the prohibitive favorite is the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's a winnable division, and, it'd be nice to see Houston being good again. And, I think fan bases do matter. And after a couple years of being kind of desolate a little bit, I think pushing some in and trying to be competitive this year, at least to me, makes some sense. Speaking of a team who needs to use this year's draft picks to be successful, your former team, the Detroit Lions, right? Detroit was 9-8 last year. They were expected only to win 6.5 games. They win 9. They narrowly missed the playoffs, in large part because they gave up a huge running game to Rashad Penny and the Seahawks early in the year, the team that beat them on the tiebreaker to make the playoffs. They go running back with Jahmyr Gibbs at 12. They go linebacker Jack Campbell at 18. Again, a guy that both guys we profiled in our Sumer Shorts. If you go to our YouTube page, you can watch what Thomas and I had to say about those guys. Mm-hmm. Then they go Brian Branch in round 2. Again, another guy in that middle of the defense can make tackles and make plays. And then they go Hendon Hooker in round 3. I look at this draft and I say, look, like long term, you don't like taking premium positions high. It's an interesting look into the soul of Brad Holmes and the GM. But I do think these picks help them win this year.
Oh, I know everyone can take their shots and do whatever they want to do. And again, I've been on that receiving side. It's not easy because you're so proud of what you do. And it's a little bit difficult to kind of stomach that at times. I mean, Jahmyr Gibbs is a good football player. I like what he has to offer. People are always going to say it's rich, right? I mean, everyone's always going to say, you should have traded back even more. It was, that's something you could have gotten the second round. Just not normally how it works. So I think they pulled a really good player in him. Whether they could have traded back in their 5 or 6 or 10 spots, who knows? It's their idea of how they want to put things together. And they, with him, Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes, they're going to bring together the guy, again, a guy that comes from Alabama. They could drill down with Nick Saban and get the person that they think is going to be a good fit, which is really important for both of those guys. Both of those guys, Jack Campbell, I mean, those guys are really good. To me, they seem like Dan Campbell guys, right? And that's what they want. They're both hard-nosed, tough working, they're very passionate football players. Jack, I mean, ostensibly could have, at least according to people, gone in the second round. You never know. Could they have waited? Could they have traded back there? Coulda, shoulda, woulda. I get it. I think both of these players are good for their football team. And I think, again, to Brad Holmes, he's doing what he thinks is best for that team. And everyone will see as time goes on, Eric, if they put forth what they're expecting out of them. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, like I said, long term, I think like the biggest concern is Jared Goff doesn't continue to produce at the way he does, or Ben Johnson leaves for a head coaching job, and you're stuck, a couple of years from now needing a quarterback, and you're like, man, could we have taken Will Levis here? Could we have could we have moved up for Anthony Richardson? All those kinds of things. I think with respect to the 2023 season, I mean, if you're a fantasy player, you're picking Jahmyr Gibbs to play running back for your team. That offensive line's amazing, right? And they block well. I mean, DeAndre Swift, they just traded DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift averaged 5.1 yards a carry, and many people don't believe DeAndre Swift has lived up to his potential. Yeah. That to me is an offensive line that is going to be conducive to Jahmyr Gibbs playing well. You look at linebacker, like I said, like that team started 1-6, and the biggest issue with that team starting 1-6 was they were getting gashed in the run game. Now, could you take a bigger defensive lineman there? Well, they moved back to 12, and eventually Jalen Carter wasn't there anymore. Like, the defensive tackles kind of in that area were not worthy of the 12th pick in many's minds. Now, again, an analytics person is never going to really endorse those kind of picks. But when I think about what's going to help the Lions win, who is if you ask the average person who the middle linebacker was for last year's Detroit Lions, they're not going to be able to tell you, right? And so that's a place. And again, I think Branch as a player inside, outside helps them, sort of in many different places. You pair him with Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, a free agent acquisition. They're plus 130 to win the NFC North. This is the first time they've been favored to win the NFC North ever. And it's the first time they've been favored to win their division since 1992, right? Like, this is a team where again, not going to endorse the picks necessarily, but I would not necessarily blame them for saying, let's get a division win on our ledger. Like, let's buy us some time here. And I do think that their 2 first-round picks help them do that.
It's interesting. It's interesting when you look at where Jack Campbell was picked and whether it was early or not, whatever anyone wants to say. There were 2 really good football players, Emmanuel Forbes. I mean, people argued that one too, right? Yep. Maybe that was a stretch. Christian Gonzalez, I think, is a really good football player. And, the kid from Pitt, I call him Kalijah. How do we
Elijah Cansey? Yep.
Elijah Cansey. Yep. I mean, that's some good defensive players around the area that they took a defender. So again, they knew that all those people were, available beyond, right? I mean, and Jigba came after him at 20, right? Then there was a run on the receivers, of course. Yep. Would they have taken? I mean, my feeling is, would they have taken one of those corners? Who's filling in, by the way, for
yeah, so they have a couple of things I think are apparent in that pick, right? Because they passed on Smith-Njigba twice, meaning they believe in Jamison Williams. And Jamison's going to miss 6 games because he was caught gambling on a different sport at the facility, so he's gone for the first 6. They got Amon-Ra St. Brown, they got Marvin Jones coming back. They have Khalif Raymond in the mix, I believe, still. And so what they're saying is we're okay there, right? With that pick. They're okay. They like the long-term prospects of Jamison Williams. With what they're saying when they don't take, now Emmanuel Forbes went 16, so he wasn't going to go 12, I don't think. A lot of people, people are giving the Lions a lot of crap, but Will McDonald went at 15. That was much earlier than people believed. People in the league actually told me that he was going to go that early. Emmanuel Forbes going at 16 was, again, better than a lot of mock drafts believed, again, showing the efficacy of those. And so at corner, they think Emmanuel Mosley, formerly of the Niners, he's going to be a player for them. Cam Sutton, formerly of the Steelers, he's going to be a player for them. They feel okay about those 2 positions there, in addition to Gardner Johnson, a guy they picked up.
And I'm sorry, that's who's filling in for Okudah, we're saying, right? They moved him.
Emmanuel Mosley was taken. Emmanuel Mosley and Sutton were taken in the first few days of free agency. Amani Oruwariye is gone. Okudah's gone. But then now Brian Branch can also play inside in that nickel for them. So I think that they think that they're okay there. And maybe they had intel that we didn't have Thomas, where they thought they knew that Branch was going to fall out of round 1, in which case, again, they were right in that case, and they ended up taking him, which I think makes a lot of sense.
I would say, I mean, nothing against Branch, and we talked about him. He was an interior guy, and I'm glad that he went where he went. That's where he should have gone. I mean, when there was talk about him going in the first round, I was a little surprised. Well, I think he's a good football player. Don't get me wrong. I like how he plays. The other thing I want to share, which is a neat little tidbit, what we used to do for Arthur Blank, and a lot of teams do, we did the report after. It was always this huge, copious report, because we just to take care of any second guess, and it was the why we wouldn't draft book. So every year we would take all those players, who we took where, and then we would show the 10 that went before them, the 10 that went after them. Then we'd show, of course, the 10 the same position, probably 5 who were before them and 5 after them, just to get a gauge. But the why we wouldn't was always interesting for an owner to see, because owners have a broad understanding, and there are a lot of reasons, I'm sure, for them that they didn't take any receivers, of course, but I mean some of the other defensive players. I mean, Deonte Banks, there are some players here, Mozzie Smith. I mean, they're going to go into saying why they didn't take some of those other players, right? And that's what you do for the owners a lot of times, just so they can put their people at ease, and they go back to talk to their sons who are 14, 15, or going back to their high schools. I'm being facetious. Or when they're going back into the media or into their world, in some of the upper echelons of the world, they're talking to their, all these multi-billionaires out there, and they're being able to talk about why we picked who we picked. Anyways, it's a funny little thing, but it's a reality.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a really good, I call those pre-mortems and post-mortems. Yes. I feel like that's always a good addition to great decision-making. Speaking of falling out of round 1, Will Levis, he goes to the second round. One of your former scouts, Rand Carthon, passes him at 11, trades up for him at 34. He goes into a quarterback room that includes Ryan Tannehill, who's really a cuttable player at this point, like as far as his contract. I mean, I think he's played decent football for them. Malik Willis, who was a third-round pick last year. So he joins that quarterback room for I think generously a rebuilding Titans team. It was a team that, they were performing well last year. They fired John Robinson, and then in a sort of an act of God, maybe they don't win another game the rest of the year, and some really close ones. They finished 7-10. They finished behind Jacksonville, and don't win the division for the first time since 2019. Don't make the playoffs for the first time since 2018, and don't have a winning season for the first time since 2015. So they're kind of in this sort of breathing out stage. Levis comes in, Thomas. Yeah. Different expectations now, right? Different expectations when you're a top 10 pick at quarterback versus when you're a top 40 pick, but outside the first round. What do we think about when we think about, the Titans, going ahead and getting Will Levis at 34?
I believe it was a very good move for them. I think it's an important move for them. Now, like you said, expectations are tempered from the top 5 picks, of course. It was devastating for the kid, of course, and his family. I get that, but he'll be just fine. Hopefully, this is a way for him to kind of show everyone that he has a lot more to offer than what was projected. I had heard, just like you had with Will, however, that according to was it Indianapolis, if Richardson wasn't there, that they were going to take him. I laughed. I only laughed because that smells 100% of agent work on the backside of this, right? We need to get this out. Is it all right if we get this out, so-called team? So, I mean, we talked about that. Jimmy Sexton, it was important for him to get that information out that someone else was interested in him, just so Will Levis could know that they weren't completely off on it. But let me just say, back to quarterbacking, and being, the first pick of the second round, it's amazing when the first round ends. It is a really exciting thing all day. You're kind of like all geeked up, wondering who's going to be there for you in that first 5 picks, especially when you're in the top 5, right? And there's going to be a lot of action on a guy like Levis. Everyone pretty well knew that someone was going to trade up for him. It was just a matter of who was going to do it, because that's normally what happens, right? Everyone's waiting. Everyone's got their boards up, and they pull tags off of certain parts of their board, and they're like, who are we going after? At least we used to do that. We would really bump it out. And look, I think it's really good for them. It'll be interesting to see what they get out of him. Is it going to be a long scenario to get him where he's comfortable to take care of some of the concerns that people have had?
Yeah, I see a couple like historical interesting things here, right? Because he goes in round 2. The draft prop was 4.5 quarterbacks. Under was, of course, a lock that only 3 guys instead of. But it's usually that last quarterback that falls right after everybody's hot and bothered for the first few. That last quarterback tends to fall. Drew Lock fell into round 2 when he was drafted. Jordan Love fell. Now he didn't fall out of round 1, but he fell pretty far, into the end of the first round. Obviously, last year with Willis, Mac Jones fell to 15, far further than we thought. Even Deshaun Kaiser back in 2017. Gone are the days where teams would trade back into round 1 to get a quarterback because of that rookie deal, because of that 5th-year option, because the 5th-year option is guaranteed now. It's higher if the guy performs really well. And so you just, it's a different calculus than when the Vikings traded up for Bridgewater or the Ravens traded up for Lamar Jackson. It's just a bigger deal. It's a different thing now. And, the Green Bay Packers are now dealing with whether or not they have till tomorrow, obviously, to exercise the option on Jordan Love, sight unseen, really, right? Other than behind the scenes, they know how good or bad he is. But like, it's a fully guaranteed thing. And I think teams now realize that it might not be worth as much as it was before, and letting some of these guys kind of pile into round 2.
Would you exercise Jordan Love's option or not?
I would, because if he blows up, then he's obviously worth way more than that. And if he's not, then I have bigger problems. You know what I'm saying? Like if Jordan Love doesn't play well, then I have a breathing period anyway, right? Like my bet was always, if I'm Green Bay, my bet was always Love and Rodgers into Love, and then I had to sort of pour more money on that bet because Rodgers won 2 MVPs, and Love was always that sort of insurance that once Rodgers left, you had that guy there. And if I made, so I'm 0 for 1 already on bets. My first bet was that Rodgers was going to fall off, and I missed that one, right? And so he played well. My second bet was that Jordan Love was going to be a plug and play kind of guy there, and we weren't going to have that much of a hiccup. Now, if I miss on those, the franchise is going to require some rebuilding anyway, similar to what Tampa Bay is doing, similar to what some of these other teams are doing. And so, I'm already kind of committed to that. So I would say yes, because if Love plays as well as I think that, if I've kept with him this whole time, the 5th-year option for him is going to be a bargain.
I think.
What do you think?
We finally agree on quarterbacks. No, I think you have to. You are so right. They have many, many deeper problems if he doesn't work out. Believe me, there's just a lot. So this is a really important time for them. We've said it all along with Brian, Gutekunst and Coach LaFleur. I mean, that's important for them. They move on from a guy, and I get that. I mean, we can all say how it was, they're losing one of the best quarterbacks. Brian's been dealing with a lot there. That's been a tough situation for them. They came in and won a lot of games riding the coattails. I mean, for sure, I'm saying their coach did, meaning this guy is a really good football player. All I'm saying now with Jordan, there's so much uncertainty there. But what I thought was interesting at 20, just over 20 million, I believe the number is, that's right around 19. That's where it should probably be. And look, again, you know that I've raised my hands many times about doing that deal with Vic Beasley, and people question the crap out of it. But when you're in that spot and you have a quarterback, the last thing you want to do, as we've talked, is all of a sudden, I think I said this on some other shows, forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but you go into this season with so little confidence in someone if you're not going to do it. That's a tough thing. You know what I'm saying? So,
well, and here's the other part of it. Like, okay, so you give Jordan Love this year. Let's say he plays, okay, you give Jordan Love the next 2 years, right? That would be your goal anyway. Let's say you don't pick up the option and you give Jordan Love 2 years, because you're not just going to give him one and move on given your situation. So you give him 2 years, cheap money, cheap, and you can't compete with him. What short of drafting another guy, what are you going to do? You're going to pick up a bridge quarterback. How much does a bridge quarterback cost the NFL? $20 million, right? Case Keenum cost Denver 18, right? Baker's costing a little less, but that's because the league believes you and not me, that he's not that good. And so like a bridge quarterback is going to cost you 20 million bucks anyway, right? So if you think about, okay, let's say he plays up to expectation this year and falls off next year, you're going to be looking for a different QB anyway. So you draft one. Jordan loves your bridge for 20 million because anyway, you're going to pick up the next guy anyway, right? Like, and so I think about, you look at the scenario planning. To me, he fits. He gives you a lot of different outs. Now, if he blows up and he's worth and you pay him 20 million, you're getting a $50 million player for $20 million for another year. And that's part of good team building. So to me, it just makes a lot of sense to go and pick up his option. We'll see what they end up doing. Brian Gutekunst went to University of Wisconsin lacrosse, where I used to teach. So hopefully he learned a little thing or two while he was on that campus there. Before we go, any thoughts on taking a specialist early? I know San Francisco took a kicker at 99. I think Michael Kanan predated you, right? But you gave him a franchise tag once. It was really cheap when you did, but specialists, a lot of specialists were taken this week. It was a little bit more than I expected. Niners go up, they replace Robbie Gould. Robbie Gould is like one of the best kickers of all time. So I understand the pressure. And Cade, I understand the pressure of wanting to take a guy high. It does not necessarily work as much as you'd think. A lot of kickers that have been taken high have flamed out. So when you look at San Francisco taking a kicker here, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Well, it's not normally where my head goes as a team builder. It's tough because I'm thinking, gosh, there are just so many other positions that we all need. Sometimes you realize, the statistical side of it, I'd be interested a little bit more from your standpoint, but when a guy's going to be scoring points, there's benefits to it. I do go back to my good friend Jason Light, who struggled. Did he draft in the second or third? What was his pick?
Yeah, they moved up in round 2, I think, for Roberto Aguayo.
Yeah. So when I think about that always stings me, right? It's got a little bit of PTSD, not personally, but when I see it, it's it's a tough deal. That said, when an organization does it, that they've done a lot of work on them. So I guarantee that the 49ers, they're a thought-out organization, very well thought out with John Lynch and his approach, and of course Kyle. They're not just doing that when they think they could pull anyone off the board. So I'm sure they have a reason for it.
Yeah, here's a good comment from Beat Gamer. It's a comp pick, so it was kind of extra. I can see that. The issue with kicker is they're so hard to predict, right? And even at the NFL level, if you look at years, you guys had Matt Bryant forever. Yeah. You tried to move off of Matt Bryant, and then who was the left-footed kicker that you guys had at the very end that didn't end up working out for you, that used Tavecchio or whatever his name was, and then he doesn't work out, and then you go back to it's just such a hard position to evaluate. But I see what you're and look, like the Niners, this is a fallacy in many cases, but they don't have a ton of holes, and so if they're thinking, okay, this is like an actual hole on our team, then they go up and get one. But there's just like a lot of, like, you look at the Bucks taking Roberto Aguayo. They also took Matt Gay, and Matt Gay lasted like half a season for them. He goes to the Rams and now has the second richest contract in the history of kickers, but just for his second team, and they got Sloman in their draft in the same year, and he gets cut beforehand. Daniel Carlson misses enough kicks in the first 2 weeks of his career with Minnesota that Zimmer and Spielman cut him. He's now one of the best kickers in football for the Vegas Raiders. So I think what's funny is that if you draft a kicker, you probably have the eval right, maybe, but you don't necessarily. I think you better be able to deal with the ups and downs, because I think Minnesota got the eval right on Daniel Carlson, that he's a great kicker, but they didn't necessarily, I think, factor in, okay, if he misses a bunch of kicks early, it might not mean he sucks. It just might mean this is an adjustment period. And are you willing to deal with that when you're a team like the Niners, who is going to want to compete for a Super Bowl this year?
We were fortunate, or my time was fortunate to be around some really good kickers, right? Whether it was in New England or whether it was at Atlanta, all the way through, even all the way up to Younghoe Koo before I left. I really enjoyed having him and pulling him from where we got him, right? Our staff did a heck of a job pulling that together. And he was a Pro Bowler last year, right? I think it was last year or the year before. I think it was the year before. The point is, you can get some good kickers up and down the line. And what I keep coming back to, there has to be a reason. Though I understand he was a compensatory. Those picks still mean the world to us, right? It doesn't matter if they're compensatory or not. So, look, it's going to be fun watching them. That's the way we look at it.
We have to have like a symbol on this show that we flash up on the screen every time you bring up the fact that a current Falcons player who is a Pro Bowler or All-Pro player was a selection or an acquisition by yourself, because those players are still plentiful on that roster with AJ Terrell, Lindstrom, guys like that. And I even forgot about Young Wei Koo. That was a player you acquired who is already, still an amazing player. A player, by the way, who was, a Los Angeles Chargers player that struggled early, jettisoned, but a good kicker, right? And he showed himself in the AAF, and obviously you guys picked him up for the Falcons, and he, like you said, he's a Pro Bowl type player. So that's my issue with kickers is, like, I think, we just don't give them enough time, and that makes sense because those kicks, they can win or lose games, and teams get a little bit antsy when they do, and you can end up burning capital that way. But hopefully for Jake Moody in San Francisco, he is he ends up being the next Jeff Wilkins or Robbie Gould for all those Niners fans out there.
Well, look, I was thinking, you do as a GM, you do go back to think about the teams you were around and the players you were around. And speaking of that, I was walking into the office yesterday to see how messy it was after we all left here. It was a mess. There was a guy, one of our people left these big these black shoes about this big, like size 14s. What size are those?
I mean, look, if we're talking about kicking things, those shoes, like, I should have been a kicker, just how big my feet were, but I just, I could not kick the ball accurately. But yes, as my friend Seren Petro, who listens to this show, a good friend of mine who hosts a show in Kansas City, would say, I'm a fun hang, but I leave a mark. I did leave my shoes because, look, when we did the show the other day, I could not be messing around with some sneakers if I ever were to, like, fold my legs or something and people see the fact that I'm not, like, at least living up to halfway up to your standard of dress, Thomas.
No, look, the reason I don't bring this up, that I jumped to the shoe thing. I was coming down the ramp, and Matt Ryan and his two little kids were coming up the ramp. So we were in the garage there, the covered garage, and we haven't talked in quite a while, so we got a chance to catch up for about 15 or 20 minutes, and we're setting up a lunch. But the reason I bring him up is good to see him. He seems like he's in good spirits, and I always have a massive amount of respect for him. And I was just thinking, brought me all the way back to my very first draft pick as a GM, and that is one that I'm very proud of, having spent he was 14 years with us, with, again, 1.5 games missed. That's a tough dude with a long history, and I think he'll get his jacket one day. I really do believe that.
Yeah, I think he was so fun to watch, and obviously it's funny. One of my good friends who listens to the show, Dave Solfaro, the day of the draft, sent me the YouTube video of your NFC Championship game against the Packers, and he goes, thinking about you and Thomas today. Thought I'd watch this game, and obviously Matt that year was I've never seen a quarterback play as hot as he did, and obviously took you guys to the Super Bowl that year with a great roster. So those are fun times. And it'll be cool to be a part of that Atlanta culture when we get down there. Thomas, this has been fun. I know, we try to keep it positive. I think a lot of, the NFL draft, every team gets better. And so we tried to have that tenor today. It's been and we got better. I really enjoyed the live show with you. I really enjoyed getting, obviously, great work by Matt Stopsky, Parker Fleming that helped us produce the show. That was a great time. If you missed it, there were some great reactions by myself and Thomas during round 1 of the draft. Go give it a listen on YouTube or wherever you find your podcasts similar to this show. Like, subscribe, rate, and review. Give us 5 stars. Tell us, tell us what you think of the show. Ask a question. We'll read it on air. And we continue to want to help grow the show as we move into the summer with some great guests as well as some great analysis. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 51 of the Sumer Sports Show.
51.